Pruning grapevines should be completed in January or February of each year, after the last frost or freeze of the season. When pruning a grapevine, it's important to leave the correct number of buds to ensure vine balance the following season.
No matter how your vine is trained, your goal when pruning should be to adequately space the dormant buds across the entire vine so that each shoot has room to grow in the coming spring. Vine vigor and crop load capacity should also be considered when deciding on how many dormant buds to leave on a vine when pruning. More vigorous vines on healthy soils should be left with more buds than a less vigorous vine. Allowing each vine to perform at its potential and not pushing it to grow more than it can promotes good vine balance and will be noticeable in the quality of your grapes at harvest. Now let's go over the 3 most common pruning styles in California wine grape vineyards. Cordon-trained spur prune vines are extremely common across California. They are trained on a trellis that provides support for the cordon and holds up the vine when it's weighed down with fruit. This training method is useful for mechanization efforts in vineyards and promotes uniform crop ripening. In all pruning and training styles, it is recommended the vines are allowed to grow for at least the first 2 years without any canopy management, and fruit is removed. This practice promotes establishment of healthy root systems that will increase the longevity of your vineyard. In a cordon-trained spur prune vine, young grapevines are trained upward to the fruiting wire in the first year to establish a trunk. The following year, 2 to 4 of the healthiest and well-placed shoots at the top of what will be the trunk are trained across the cordon wire. These shoots will become the cordon. Grape growers can also choose to train a unilateral cordon with only a single shoot. Now that you've trained your cordons, your goal is to decide on where to place the growing points on the cordons you've trained. These growing points will start out as 2 bud spurs, but over time they will accumulate older wood from pruning each year and become arms, similar to layers of paint on a wall. Arms on a cordon should be spaced about every 6 inches to allow adequate space for shoots to grow. When pruning a cordon-trained spur prune vine, cut 1 chosen shoot on each arm back to 2 bud spurs. In spring each year, these spurs will be the points at which the new shoots will grow and eventually produce crop. There are many different trellising systems for cordon-trained spur prune vines. However, they are all pruned to have 2 bud spurs at each established arm position during winter. The other common pruning style for trellised vines is cane pruning. Cane prune vines are typically head-trained, resembling small trees, and are grown on a trellis system. Similar to cordon-trained spur prune vines, cane prune vines are trained so that a trellis can support the vine and crop load weight throughout the year. However, instead of mini spurs, cane prune vines utilize the buds on full canes as fruiting points, while still retaining some renewal spurs for next year. This system requires the pruner to remove the growing cane at the end of the season and calls for larger cuts than on spur prune vines. In cane pruning, the most common technique is called the guillot system. Start by selecting shoots near the head of the vine to act as next year's fruiting canes and renewal spurs. The pruner should then remove last year's fruiting cane up to the chosen shoots. In the guillot pruning system, the canes that are chosen for next year's fruiting are cut to 8 to 10 buds. These buds will become the canes that produce clusters in the coming spring. Depending on the conditions and vigor of the vine, 1 to 4 canes are typically left on the vine when pruning. For every 3 fruiting canes left on the vine, the guillot system calls for 2 renewal spurs with 2 buds each. When cane pruning, the number of fruiting canes for next spring can be modified based on the vigor of the site and of the vine. Here, we have 2 canes instead of 4, with only 1 renewal spur per vine. This site is likely to promote less vine growth than the one we just saw. Alternatively, a grower may choose to forego a trellis system altogether with a head-trained spur prune vine supported by a single post. As with cordon-trained spur prune vines, this style of pruning leads to the development of arms made of subsequent 2 bud spurs, stacked on top of one another like vehicle registration stickers on a license plate or different layers of paint on a wall. Like the other 2 pruning styles, head-trained spur prune vines have a trunk. They also have arms and 2 bud spurs. However, because they are not trained on a trellis, they do not have a permanent cordon or fruiting canes. This pruning style is very similar to cordon-trained spur prune vines. However, instead of arms being organized linearly along a cordon, they are distributed radially and vertically to allow shoots enough space to grow, like a tornado of shoots spinning around a single trunk.
Here we have a cordon-trained spur pruned vine that's unilateral, so this only has one cordon on it. But this cordon is more than 2 years old, and it's permanent wood at this point. When pruning a grapevine that is cordon trained and spur pruned, you first want to make sure that you have the correct number of arms. This vine is probably 3 years old and requires a arm position to be formed at each place that there is a shoot currently, with some exceptions. So when pruning a cordon trained spur pruned vine, you want to typically prune to 2 buds. That's one bud. And as we look over here, there's another bud, so we want to clip above it at an angle to prevent water from dripping down onto that bud if there was rain in the coming season. In regions with less vigor, you might want to reduce the amount of buds on each vine to 1 bud. This will ensure fewer clusters and canes for the following season. If you can see, we are leaving 2 bud spurs on this vine, and these will become the arm positions for the next year. So next year, these will be pruned the same way to 2 bud spurs, and this wood will still be there and will become part of the arm. Over time, that arm will grow in height, so you want to make sure that you're only cutting to 2 buds, possibly 1, depending on the vigor of your climate and the vine. Arms should be spaced 6 inches apart, or 2 per foot, and they should each be as short as possible to maintain your vineyard and prevent mechanical damage further down the line. When you're pruning, make sure not to cut off any buds that you want for the following season. These are going to be essential for you. However, if you are in a cold region, you might want to add a couple extra buds on top of your 2 bud spur. This will help protect against frost damage, because as the vine wakes up from dormancy in spring, the first shoots that'll pop out of their buds are the ones highest up on the cane. If you want to avoid damage from frost, and you expect there may be another frost in the coming season, you want to leave those buds so that they're the ones that are damaged. Any green tissue that is exposed to cold temperatures will get frost damage. The lower buds will be delayed in their break if you leave a couple extra buds on top of a 2 bud spur, and then you can remove those 2 upper buds later in the season to prevent excess shoots. This is called pre-pruning, and it's pretty common in cold regions. One measure of plant health and vigor is pruning weight. In the winter, when you're pruning, take the time to weigh out what tissue you pruned off of the vine to see how much it grew that previous year, and if you need to correct for any number of shoots to control vigor. If your pruning weights are too high, you may have had too high of vigor and want to leave more shoots on the vine for the following year. If your pruning weights are low, then you might want to consider having fewer shoots in the subsequent year. Having fewer shoots on a less vigorous vine means that that vine can focus on producing better shoots and better buds with the few shoots that they have left. So take your bathroom scale or your kitchen scale, or if you have a field scale, use a field scale and measure the amount of pruning weight you got off of each vine at the end of a season. When pruning, you don't want to leave any tissue on the wires. These are harbors for disease or pests, and removing them is essential to maintain the health of your vineyard. Many diseases can overwinter in this kind of wood. This is a tendril, but you also don't want to leave canes on the wire. Make sure you pull all your canes off of the wire as you're pruning them. Make sure to properly discard pruned canes at the end of your pruning cycle. These can have disease in them. If your vine is diseased, these will retain it and keep it in your vineyard, and you don't want that. So make sure you dispose of these properly. You can mulch them into the soil, or you can dispose of them as green waste.